The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 12. Fourth Book, Part 1. However much inconvenience the quartering of the French had caused us, we had become so accustomed to it that we could not fail to miss it, nor could we children fail to feel as if the house were deserted. Moreover, it was not decreed that we should again attain perfect family unity. New lodgers were already bespoken, and after some sweeping and scouring, planing and rubbing with beeswax, painting and varnishing, the house was completely restored again. The Chancery Director Moritz, with his family, very worthy friends of my parents, moved in. He was not a native of Frankfurt, but an able jurist and man of business, and managed the legal affairs of many small princes and counts and lords. I never saw him otherwise than cheerful and pleasant and diligent with his law papers. His wife and children, gentle, quiet, and benevolent, did not indeed increase the sociableness of our house, for they kept to themselves, but a stillness, a peace returned, which we had not enjoyed for a long time. I now again occupied my attic room, in which the ghosts of the many pictures sometimes hovered before me, while I strove to frighten them away by labor and study. The Councillor of Legation, Moritz, a brother of the Chancellor, came from this time often to our house. He was even more a man of the world, had a handsome figure, while his manners were easy and agreeable. He also managed the affairs of different persons of rank, and on occasions of meetings of creditors and imperial commissions frequently came into contact with my father. They had a high opinion of each other, and commonly stood on the side of the creditors, though they were generally obliged to perceive, much to their vexation, that a majority of the agents on such occasions are usually gained over to the side of the debtors. The Councillor of Legation readily communicated his knowledge, was fond of mathematics, and, as these did not occur in his present course of life, he made himself a pleasure by helping me on in this branch of study. I was thus enabled to finish my architectural sketches more accurately than heretofore, and to profit more by the instruction of a drawing master, who now also occupied us an hour every day. This good old man was indeed only half an artist. We were obliged to draw and combine strokes, from which eyes and noses, lips and ears, nay, at last whole faces and heads, were to arise. But of natural or artistic forms there was no thought. We were tormented a long while with this quid pro quo of the human figure, and when the so-called passions of Lebrun were given us to copy, it was supposed at last that we had made great progress. But even these caricatures did not improve us. Then we went off to landscapes, foliage, and all the things which in ordinary instruction are practised without consistency or method. Finally, we dropped into close imitation and neatness of strokes, without troubling ourselves about the merit or taste of the original. In these endeavours our father led the way in an exemplary manner. He had never drawn, but he was unwilling to remain behind, now that his children pursued this art, and would give, even in his old age, an example of how they should proceed in their youth. He therefore copied several heads of Piazzetta from his well-known sheets, in small octavo, with an English lead pencil upon the finest Dutch paper. In these he not only observed the greatest clearness of outline, but most accurately imitated the hatching of the copper plate with a light hand, only too slightly, as, in his desire to avoid hardness, he brought no keeping into his sketches. Yet they were always soft and accurate. His unrelaxing and untiring assiduity went so far that he drew the whole considerable collection number by number, while we children jumped from one head to another and chose only those that pleased us. About this time the long debated project, long under consideration, for giving us lessons in music was carried into effect, and the vast impulse to it certainly deserves mention. It was settled that we should learn the harpsichord, but there was always a dispute about the choice of a master. At last I went once accidentally into the room of one of my companions, who was just taking his lesson on the harpsichord, and found the teacher a most charming man. For each finger of the right and left hand he had a nickname, by which he indicated in the merriest way when it was to be used. The black and white keys were likewise symbolically designated, and even the tones appeared under figurative names. Such a motley company worked most pleasantly together. Fingering and time seemed to become perfectly easy and obvious, and while the scholar was put into the best humor, everything else succeeded beautifully. Scarcely had I reached home than I importuned my parents to set about the matter in good earnest at last, and give us this incomparable man for our master on the harpsichord. They hesitated and made inquiries. They indeed heard nothing bad of the teacher, but at the same time nothing particularly good. Meanwhile I had informed my sister of all the droll names. We could hardly wait for the lesson, and succeeded in having the man engaged. The reading of the notes began first, but as no jokes occurred here, we comforted ourselves with the hope that, when we went to the harpsichord and the fingers were needed, the jocular method would commence. But neither keys nor fingering seemed to afford opportunity for any comparisons. Dry as the notes were, with their strokes on and between the 5 lines, the black and white keys were no less so, and not a syllable was heard either of thumbling, pointerling, or goldfinger, while the countenance of the man remained as imperturbable during his dry teaching as it had been before during his dry jests. My sister reproached me most bitterly for having deceived her, and actually believed that it was all an invention of mine. But I was myself confounded, and learned little, though the man at once went regularly enough to work, for I kept always expecting that the former jokes would make their appearance, and so consoled my sister from one day to another. They did not reappear, however, and I should never have been able to explain the riddle if another accident had not solved it for me. One of my companions came in during a lesson, and at once all the pipes of the humorous jet d'eau were opened. The thumblings and pointerlings, the pickers and stealers, as he used to call the fingers, the fallings and gallings, meaning F and G, the fillings and gillings, meaning F and G sharp. Footnote: the names of the sharp notes in German terminate in is, and hence F and G sharp are called vis and gis, became once more extant and made the most wonderful mannikins. My young friend could not leave off laughing, and was rejoiced that one could learn in such a merry manner. He vowed that he would give his parents no peace till they had given him such an excellent man for a teacher. And thus the way to two arts was early enough opened to me, according to the principles of a modern theory of education, merely by good luck, and without any conviction that I should be furthered therein by a native talent. My father maintained that everybody ought to learn drawing, for which reason he especially venerated the Emperor Maximilian, by whom this had been expressly commanded. He therefore held me to it more steadily than to music, which, on the other hand, he especially recommended to my sister, and even out of the hours for lessons kept her fast during a good part of the day at her harpsichord. But the more I was in this way made to press on, the more I wished to press forward of myself, and my hours of leisure were employed in all sorts of curious occupations. From my earliest years I felt a love for the investigation of natural things. It is often regarded as an instinct of cruelty that children like at last to break, tear, and devour objects with which for a long time they have played, and which they have handled in various manners. Yet even in this way is manifested the curiosity, the desire of learning how such things hang together, how they look within. I remember that when a child I pulled flowers to pieces to see how the leaves were inserted into the calyx, or even plucked birds to observe how the feathers were inserted into the wings. Children are not to be blamed for this, when even our naturalists believe they get their knowledge oftener by separation and division than by union and combination, more by killing than by making alive. An armed lodestone, very neatly sewed up in scarlet cloth, was one day destined to experience the effects of this spirit of inquiry; for the secret force of attraction which it exercised, not only on the little iron bar attached to it, but which was of such a kind that it could gain strength and could daily bear a heavier weight, this mysterious virtue had so excited my admiration that for a long time I was pleased with merely staring at its operation. But at last I thought I might arrive at some nearer revelation by tearing away the external covering. This was done, but I became no wiser in consequence, as the naked iron taught me nothing further. This also I took off, and I held in my hand the mere stone, with which I never grew weary of making experiments of various kinds on filings and needles, experiments from which my youthful mind drew no further advantages beyond that of a varied experience. I could not manage to reconstruct the whole arrangement. The parts were scattered, and I lost the wondrous phenomenon at the same time with the apparatus. Nor was I more fortunate in putting together an electrical machine. A friend of the family, whose youth had fallen in the time when electricity occupied all minds, often told us how, when a child, he had desired to possess such a machine. He got together the principal requisites, and by the aid of an old spinning wheel and some medicine bottles had produced tolerable results. As he readily and frequently repeated the story, and imparted to us some general information on electricity, we children found the thing very plausible, and long tormented ourselves with an old spinning wheel and some medicine bottles, without producing even the smallest result. We nevertheless adhered to our belief, and were much delighted when, at the time of the fair, among other rarities, magical and legerdemain tricks, an electrical machine performed its marvels, which, like those of magnetism, were at that time already very numerous. The want of confidence in the public method of instruction was daily increasing. People looked about for private tutors, and because single families could not afford the expense, several of them united to attain their object. Yet the children seldom agreed. The young man had not sufficient authority, and after frequently repeated vexations, there were only angry partings. It is not surprising, therefore, that other arrangements were thought of, which should be more permanent as well as more advantageous. The thought of establishing boarding schools, pensionen, had arisen from the necessity which every one felt of having the French language taught and communicated orally. My father had brought up a young person who had been his footman, valet, secretary, and, in short, successively, all in all. This man, whose name was Pfeil, spoke French well. After he had married, and his patrons had to think of a situation for him, they hit upon the plan of making him establish a boarding school, which extended gradually into a small academy, in which everything necessary, and at last even Greek and Latin, were taught. The extensive connections of Frankfort caused young French and Englishmen to be brought to this establishment, that they might learn German and acquire other accomplishments. Pfeil, who was a man in the prime of life and of the most wonderful energy and activity, superintended the whole very laudably; and as he could never be employed enough, and was obliged to keep music teachers for his scholars, he set about music on the occasion, and practised the harpsichord with such zeal, that without having previously touched a note, he very soon played with perfect readiness and spirit. He seemed to have adopted my father's maxim, that nothing can more cheer and excite young people than when at mature years one declares oneself again a learner, and at an age when new accomplishments are required with difficulty, one endeavors nevertheless, by zeal and perseverance, to excel the younger, who are more favored by nature. By this love of playing the harpsichord, Pfeil was led to the instruments themselves, and while he hoped to obtain the best, came into connection with Frederici of Gera, whose instruments were celebrated far and wide. He took a number of them on sale, and had now the joy of seeing not only one piano, but many set up in his residence, and of practising and being heard upon them. The vivacity of this man brought a great rage for music into our house. My father remained on lasting good terms with him, up to certain points of dispute. A large piano of Frederici was purchased also for us, which I, adhering to my harpsichord, hardly touched, but which so much increased my sister's troubles as, to duly honour the new instrument, she had to spend some time longer every day in practice, while my father, as overseer, and Pfeil, as a model and encouraging friend, alternately took their positions at her side. A singular taste of my father's caused much inconvenience to us children. This was the cultivation of silk, of the advantages of which, if it were more widely extended, he had a high opinion. Some acquaintances at Hanau, where the breeding of the worms was carried on with great care, gave him the immediate impulse. At the proper season the eggs were sent to him from that place, and as soon as the mulberry trees showed sufficient leaves, they had to be stripped, and the scarcely visible creatures were most diligently tended. Tables and stands with boards were set up in a garret chamber to afford them more room and sustenance, but they grew rapidly, and after their last change of skin were so voracious that it was scarcely possible to get leaves enough to feed them. No, they had to be fed day and night, as everything depends upon there being no deficiency of nourishment when the great and wondrous change is about to take place in them. When the weather was favorable, this business could indeed be regarded as a pleasant amusement. But if the cold set in, so that the mulberry trees suffered, it was exceedingly troublesome. Still more unpleasant was it when rain fell during the last epoch, for these creatures cannot at all endure moisture, and the wet leaves had to be carefully wiped and dried, which could not always be done quite perfectly; and for this, or perhaps some other reason also, various diseases came among the flock, by which the poor things were swept off in thousands. The state of corruption which ensued produced a smell really pestilential, and because the dead and diseased had to be taken away and separated from the healthy, the business was indeed extremely wearisome and repulsive, and caused many an unhappy hour to us children. After we had 1 year passed the finest weeks of the spring and summer in tending the silkworms, we were obliged to assist our father in another business, which, though simpler, was no less troublesome. The Roman views, which, bound by black rods at the top and bottom, had hung for many years on the walls of the old house, had become very yellow through the light dust and smoke, and not a little unsightly through the flies. If such uncleanliness was not to be tolerated in the new house, yet, on the other hand, these pictures had gained in value to my father in consequence of his longer absence from the places represented; for at the outset such copies serve only to renew and revive the impressions received shortly before. They seem trifling in comparison, and at the best only a melancholy substitute. But as the remembrance of the original forms fades more and more, the copies imperceptibly assume their place. They become as dear to us as those once were, and what we at first contemned now gains esteem and affection. Thus it is with all copies, and particularly with portraits. No one is easily satisfied with the counterfeit of an object still present, but how we value every silhouette of one who is absent or departed. In short, with this feeling of his former extravagance, my father wished that these engravings might be restored as much as possible. It was well known that this could be done by bleaching, and the operation, always critical with large plates, was undertaken under rather unfavorable circumstances, for the large boards on which the smoked engravings were moistened and exposed to the sun stood in the gutters before the garret windows, leaning against the roof, and were therefore liable to many accidents. The chief point was that the paper should never thoroughly dry, but must be kept constantly moist. This was the duty of my sister and myself; and the idleness, which would have been otherwise so desirable, was excessively annoying on account of the tedium and impatience, and the watchfulness which allowed of no distraction. The end, however, was attained, and the bookbinder, who fixed each sheet upon thick paper, did his best to match and repair the margins, which had been here and there torn by our inadvertence. All the sheets together were bound in a volume, and for this time preserved. That we children might not be wanting in every variety of life and learning, A teacher of the English language had to announce himself just at this time, who pledged himself to teach anybody not entirely raw in languages English in 4 weeks, and to advance him to such a degree that, with some diligence, he could help himself farther. His price was moderate, and he was indifferent as to the number of scholars at one lesson. My father instantly determined to make the attempt, and took lessons, together with my sister and myself, of this expeditious master. The hours were faithfully kept. There was no want of repeating our lessons. Other exercises were neglected rather than this during the 4 weeks, and the teacher parted from us, and we from him, with satisfaction. As he remained longer in the town, and found many employers, he came from time to look after us and to help us, grateful that we had been among the first who placed confidence in him, and proud to be able to cite us as examples to the others. My father, in consequence of this, entertained a new anxiety, that English might neatly stand in the series of my other studies in languages. Now I will confess that it became more and more burdensome for me to take my occasions for study, now from this grammar or collection of examples, now from that, now from one author, now from another, and thus to divert my interest in a subject every hour. It occurred to me, therefore, that I might dispatch all at the same time, and I invented a romance of 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, who, separated from each other and scattered over the world, should communicate with each other alternately as to their conditions and feelings. The eldest brother gives an account in good German of all the manifold objects and incidents of his journey. The sister, in a ladylike style, with short sentences and nothing but stops, much as Siegwart was afterwards written, answers now him, now the other brothers, partly about domestic matters and partly about affairs of the heart. One brother studies theology, and writes a very formal Latin, to which he often adds a Greek postscript. To another brother, holding the place of mercantile clerk at Hamburg, the English correspondence naturally falls, while a still younger one at Marseilles has the French. For the Italian was found a musician on his first trip into the world, while the youngest of all, a sort of pert nestling, had applied himself to Jew German, the other languages having been cut off from him, and by means of his frightful ciphers brought the rest of them into despair, and my parents into a hearty laugh at the good notion. To obtain matter for filling up this singular form, I studied the geography of the countries in which my creations resided, and by inventing for those dry localities all sorts of human incidences which had some affinity with the characters and employments of my heroes. Thus my exercise books became much more voluminous, my father was better satisfied, and I was much sooner made aware of my deficiency in both what I had acquired and possessed of my own. Now, as such things once begun have no end nor limits, so it happened in the present case, for while I strove to attain the odd Jew German, and to write it as well as I could read it, I soon discovered that I ought to know Hebrew, from which alone the modern corrupted dialect could be derived and handled with any certainty. I consequently explained the necessity of my learning Hebrew to my father, and earnestly besought his consent, for I had a still higher object. Everywhere I heard it said that to understand the Old as well as the New Testament, the original languages were requisite. The latter I could read quite easily, because, that there might be no want of exercise even on Sundays, the so-called epistles and gospels had after church to be recited, translated, and in some measure explained. I now purposed doing the same thing with the Old Testament, the peculiarities of which had always especially interested me. My father, who did not like to do anything by halves, determined to request the rector of our gymnasium, one Dr. Albrecht, to give me private lessons weekly, until I should have acquired what was most essential in so simple a language, for he hoped that, if it would not be dispatched as soon as English was learned, it could at least be managed in double the time. Rector Albrecht was one of the most original figures in the world, short, broad, but not fat, ill-shaped without being deformed, in short, an Aesop in gown and wig. His more than 70-years-old face was completely twisted into a sarcastic smile, while his eyes always remained large, and though red, were always brilliant and intelligent. He lived in the old cloister of the Barefoot Friars, the seat of the gymnasium. Even as a child, I had often visited him in company with my parents, and had, with a kind of trembling delight, glided through the long dark passages, the chapels transformed into reception rooms, the place broken up and full of stairs and corners. Without making me uncomfortable, he questioned me familiarly whenever we met, and praised and encouraged me. One day, on the changing of the pupils' places after a public examination, he saw me standing as a mere spectator not far from his chair, while he distributed the silver Premia Virtutis et Diligentiae. I was probably gazing very eagerly upon the little bag out of which he drew the medals. He nodded to me, descended a step, and handed me one of the silver pieces. My joy was great, although others thought that this gift, bestowed upon a boy not belonging to the school, was out of all order. But for this the good old man cared but little, having always played the eccentric, and that in a striking manner. He had a very good reputation as a schoolmaster, and understood his business, though age no more allowed him to practice it thoroughly. But almost more than by his own infirmities, he was hindered by greater circumstances, and, as I already knew, he was satisfied neither with the consistory, the inspectors, the clergy, nor the teachers. To his natural temperament, which inclined to satire and the watching for faults and defects, he allowed free play both in his programs and his public speeches, and as Lucian was almost the only writer whom he read and esteemed, he spiced all that he said and wrote with biting ingredients. Fortunately for those with whom he was dissatisfied, he never went directly to work, but only jeered at the defects which he wanted to reprove with hints, allusions, classic passages, and scripture texts. His delivery, moreover, he always read his discourses, was unpleasant, unintelligible, and, above all, was often interrupted by a cough, but more frequently by a hollow, paunch-convulsing laugh, with which he was wont to announce and accompany the biting passages. This singular man I found to be mild and obliging when I began to take lessons of him. I now went to his house daily at 6 o'clock in the evening, and always experienced a secret pleasure when the outer door closed behind me, and I had to thread the long, dark cloister passage. We sat in his library at a table covered with oilcloth, a much-read Lucian never quitting his side. End of Section 12.